Distinguished speakers, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. On behalf of Dr. Mohammed Al Ali, CEO of Trends Research and Advisory, I'd like to thank and welcome all guests joining us here today. In keeping with the mission of Trends Research and Advisory contribute to the debate surrounding the major challenges of our time, we continue our series of forward-looking discussions and seminars with an E-Symposium titled The Energy Transition and Future Implications and Prospects for the MENA region and Asia. With approximately 81% of the global energy mix still based on fossil fuels, the need to decarbonize energy and energy systems is imperative. Variously described as the green or low carbon energy transition, it is in reality much more than that, even that. The ultimate goal of transitioning away from fossil fuels to secure, reliable, and affordable clean energy systems is enormously complex and rife with trade-offs and uncertainties that will need to be balanced. Recent geopolitical instability and turmoil in global economic, energy, and food systems have further complicated the picture, certainly, but at the same time, political commitment to the energy transition has never been higher. The importance of Asia and the Middle East to the success of the global energy transition can hardly be understated. An ongoing regional shift in energy demand is witnessing energy demand increasingly moving towards non-OECD countries, including China, India, and other Asian nations. Currently, Asia-Pacific accounts for almost 50% of global energy demand, 60% of the global population, and in 2020, almost 50% of the energy consumed in Asia was from fossil fuels. While the Middle East is the preeminent supplier of primary energy, accounting for 40% of proved oil reserves and 40% of proved gas reserves, the region has also continuously to actively invest in decarbonization, renewables, and clean energy projects as part of long-term efforts to support the global energy transition. An often underappreciated aspect of decarbonization is its large-scale reliance on certain metals and minerals, including lithium, nickel, and cobalt, for electrical vehicles, storage, solar panels, wind turbines, and other components. As global demand for these materials gathers momentum, it will be important to ensure the development of sustainable and equitable extractive industries. Today's speakers and moderator are distinguished by having reached the pinnacle of these respective professions, and as such are qualified to contribute their perspectives to the wider debate about the factors shaping the energy transition. With that, I would like to wish you an enjoyable discussion, and the floor is yours, Your Excellency, Ambassador Tamiz Ahmed.
Thank you very much. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, there is a pervasive sense of crisis. We have an ongoing war in Europe, and we've had ongoing conflicts in Syria and Yemen for a very long time. We also have sense of severe shortages. There are concerns even with regard to food security. And certainly we are in the throes of an energy-related crisis. How did all this happen? Where is it? What is happening now? What caused it? And where are we likely to go? I'm grateful to Trends for having put together this event. We have two of the world's most distinguished energy commentators with us. We have Dr. Adnan Shahabadeen, former Acting Director General of OPEC, also held directorial positions in UNESCO and IAEA. He has been a very major and a very powerful voice in regard to energy transition. And besides him, now he is affiliated with the Oxford Institute of Energy Studies. We also have with us Dr. Philip Andrew Speed. He's a senior fellow. He's a senior fellow at the Oxford Institute and is also a very distinguished commentator on energy-related issues. He has a very distinct background in that he started out as a geologist and is therefore very familiar with the actual discovery and development of fields in different parts of the world. Now he's an academic and has specialized in China and in Asia in general. Let me start with you, Dr. Adnan Shahabadeen. We have this sense of crisis. A German minister has referred to it as four interwoven crises relating to inflation, energy, food, and climate. Doctor, how did we reach this stage? And why do we have this extraordinary sense of crisis, a truly global crisis?
Well, of course, the war amplified and triggered across the threshold other forces that were in play. So I'm not going to comment on the war because I think everybody understands what is the role of the current war in triggering everything that was already building up. For example, we were in the midst of debate about the speed of the energy transition. Who will bear the cost of the energy transition? It's estimated, according to the latest IEA report, that we will be needing approximately 5 trillion US dollars to make the energy transition happen by 2030. 5 trillions by 2030. We are at less than 2 trillions right now. We have to double or triple. We're talking about enormous amount of money and investment in order to reach the energy transition. Let's remember, we don't have scarcity of fuels. What we have is how do we speed up the transition from the current fuels that we are using, oil and gas and coal, the dominant fuels. They're abundant, they're available. If we will continue to use them, there will be no big problem. There will be minor problems here and there. But this transition from fossil fuels to clean fuels and the need to do it as fast as possible, while we don't have the means to do it as fast as possible in terms of the willingness to invest, because the developing countries, as you very well know, don't have the means, number one. Number two, they have not put into the atmosphere most of the CO2 that's currently into the atmosphere, but they will be aggravating the problem in order to fuel their economy. So that's another force. You know, they want to sort of have the means to do what the developed countries have done. But of course, the energy transition will not have the luxury to allow that. And that's the dilemma. And that's why, for example, in COP25 and COP26, COP meaning the Conference of the Parties participant in the United Nations framework for the climate change, have been bogged down in the negotiations. How do we make those investments? Now, of course, the war came in, and Russia is a major oil and gas supplier. And because of the war and the sanctions imposed by the Europeans against Russian oil and gas and other things, that not only aggravated the transition, but also affected inflation and the economy, which in turn deprived the transition from investment. And so that's where we are.
Thank you, sir. We already had a problem. We had the problem of funding energy transition. And on top of that, all issues have got aggravated because of this conflict. Dr. Philip Andrew Speed, I have some questions for you with regard to this conflict. We find that the war began on 24th February. It had been brewing for some months earlier, and there was an expectation that something dreadful might happen. But initially, the Americans did not talk about energy at all. Abruptly, on 8th March, the US president announced an embargo on the purchase of Russian energy resources. No consultation with the Europeans, no consultation with the Gulf producers. And therefore, you find that the global energy markets are in turmoil. Prices immediately started going up. Europeans did not know how to handle this problem. And therefore, you have the situation of the American agenda, because the Americans didn't depend on the Russians to the extent everyone else did. No consultation with any of those directly dependent on the Russians. Could we not have handled this better than the way it has been handled so far?
Yes, I think clearly it would have been nice for the Americans to consult with Europe first. I mean, after all, it was President Biden, not President Trump, who was in office, and we'd expected in Europe a greater consultation. But I think at the end of the day, Europe had to do something beyond sending arms. And, what else do you sanction if you don't sanction energy? So, this isn't my specialization, as it were, but I think at the end of the day, some sanctions against energy and energy-related products had to be taken. Again, it's often not a matter of what is done, but how it was done, I think, was probably unfortunate.
Dr. Philip, a follow-up question. Today, the Europeans seem to be in a very cruel predicament. On the one hand, the Russians are reducing, if not stopping, their supplies to the Europeans at a time when they are ill prepared for this situation. But at the same time, they are also supplying arms to Ukraine and are a very major part of supporting the Ukrainian war effort.
Yeah.
So you can't have it both ways. The Europeans can't be screaming that, oh, our supplies are being stopped by the Russians, and on the other hand, keep on being a major military partner as far as Ukraine is concerned. So how do the Europeans get out to, how are they expected to be handling this serious problem that is before them now?
Yes, I mean, as you put it, it's quite clear that, they want their cake and eat it, as it were. They want to be able to sanction Russia and then complain if Russia stops completely sending oil or gas, and at the same time they're sending weapons. And they've got themselves in a difficult situation, and they're frantically, restarting coal-fired power stations. They're building LNG terminals, seeking LNG contracts from elsewhere. It's an impossible situation. But otherwise, what do? You sit and watch. And I think that was, for most European populations and leaders, that is unacceptable. So it's a worst of but the only possible choice of the way to go. But it's going to be difficult. This next winter is, I live in Scotland, in Northern Europe, where it's cold. This next winter is going to be tough across Europe, very tough.
If I may,
yes.
If I may, this is an important point, because I can understand the predicament of Europe, and I'm right now in Europe, and I'm listening to the discussion taking place. But throughout my career, when I was working in OPEC in particular, the message that we kept receiving from the IEA, International Energy Agency, which represent the Europeans and the American, the developed countries, the OECD countries in particular, the message was to OPEC countries, don't get energy involved in conflicts. That is, if you have an Iran-Iraq war, let oil continue to flow. If you have a Suez Canal, don't block the Suez Canal. If you have the 1967 war, the embargo was wrong. So there was this message that energy should not be used as a weapon. And yet both sides now of the conflict are using energy as a weapon. The Russians are using it as a weapon, and the Europeans are using it as a weapon. And there is a lesson here for us, not just in the European countries, a lesson for all of us, that somehow you use all what's available to your hand, irrespective of the implication on other people. And that's what's happening. Because the Russians and the Europeans are using energy as a weapon, as part of the weapon, other peoples are feeling the impact, high energy prices, food crisis, and all of the other things. So I just wanted to insert this historical perspective about the role of energy in wars. When it comes to you, you have to use it, but when it comes to others, they shouldn't use it.
Yes,
and
you're
of course,
right. Yes.
And of course, you have to go back to the Cold War, when the gas flowed from the Soviet Union to Germany, despite the fact that everybody's finger was on the nuclear trigger.
And of course,
Dr. Adnan, you are absolutely right. You have reminded us of the 73 oil embargo. And you remember how angry the Americans were. And there was, in fact, talk in Washington about bombing the region. And many of them, and there were some of the remarks were quite racist, very hostile anti-Arab remarks with regard to the oil embargo.
And
There
it
is no
failed.
way.
And the embargo failed.
Sorry?
I'm sorry. I'm just saying is that the embargo failed. The oil embargo failed. Why? And the current sanctions on oil will fail because oil is fungible.
Yes.
Oil, if you block one side, if you close one valve, it goes the other way around. And that's what's happening. We are seeing a rebalancing. Gas is something else, but oil is fungible. I'm sorry, Ambassador, but I wanted to add this point.
Yeah, no, picking up from your remarks, we have to take a look at prices. We have today a situation, a war situation. We already had before that an embargo on the Iranian supply, Venezuelan supply. We've had conflict situations in Libya. We have instability in Iraq. And on top of that, now we have this confusion relating to Russian supply. But I have read that there are some longer term concerns, that there has not been enough investment in upstream and downstream, as far as fossil fuels are concerned, particularly the hydrocarbon. So we are today looking at a situation where a combination of several factors has created this extraordinary rise in prices, which is hurting global economies. And everyone is worried about the future. The uncertainty before us is quite severe. What would you advise us with regard to how should we handle this problem of production, of supply at a time of such grave crisis?
If you allow me, I could just venture the following point. This was building up a couple of years ago with the energy transition report from the IEA came out in 2021, which basically said that there is no need for new investment in new oil projects. That was a scenario that was developed by the IEA, one of many scenarios, but that received a lot of attention. And that started a movement, a popular movement, government movement that impacted the international oil companies and investors in oil and gas. And this ESG investment, that is, do not put your investment in something that's not clean immediately before even you have prepared yourself for the energy transition. So with no new investment in oil and gas, and not only the international oil companies, but there was pressure indirectly on the national oil companies, psychological pressure. Why should I invest if the IEA is telling us don't invest? And so now we are caught short, as you have pointed out. And the war came in, and that amplified the impact of no investment. Because before we had no investment, we had a tight market. Prices were rising because we had a tight market. We had very limited spare capacity, and we were coming out of COVID. And coming out of COVID meant you absorb all of the spare capacity or most of it, because the economy started growing rapidly. And now the war comes in, and you have reduced the oil flow from Russia. Currently, it's estimated, according to what I have seen and from Oxford Institute, Russian oil is in 2022 will be constricted by about 600,000 barrels. That's not too much, but in 2023, it's expected the reduction in oil from Russia, it will reach about 2.6 million barrels. That's too much to absorb with additional capacity somewhere else. President Biden, I assume, in his travel to Saudi Arabia, will be asking the Saudis, who have probably the most spare capacity available today, to try to put it on the market. But the market doesn't have much spare capacity. And if this war go on for a long time, which everybody I talk to here expected to go on for a long time, that means we will have higher prices for a long time as a payment for no investment that was primarily called by the International Energy Agency.
Absolutely. Dr. Philip, this brings me to the issue of climate change. There seems to be again a contradiction that on the one hand, the world is dependent on fossil fuels, is likely to be dependent for the next 20 or 30 years. At the same time, we are asking the international community to give up on conventional fuels and move towards other renewables, which involve a lot of investment, have a very long gestation period. Many of those are not yet commercially viable. And we are not just talking to the developed countries, we are talking to the entire international community, which includes a very large number of developing countries, many of them very hard hit by the pandemic and already in parlous economic situation. How is the world supposed to balance this kind of contradictions that on the one hand, we are supposed to be committed to climate change initiative, and on the other hand, we have to provide energy security to our people on daily basis?
Well, I was just thinking as Dr. Adnan spoke, again, I was taking back to the 1970s, which is when I got my driving license. And I mean, what it did trigger, there was several years of very high prices. It triggered a rethink about energy supplies, energy efficiency, particularly efficiency of use in countries notably like Japan, but across Europe as well. So I think we're in a crisis, but a crisis is an opportunity. So will there be a change of mindset to accelerate the transition away from fossil fuels? Yeah, so countries, I mean, as you explained, there are sort of two types of countries. There are countries that have funds or access to funds and can create credible projects that can be funded. That can accelerate, and we're starting to see that already, whether it be renewable energy, storage, energy efficiency, energy saving, just doing less, turning down the heating, turning down the air conditioning, all of these things. I think the challenge, as you quite rightly pointed out, is for those countries, particularly the highly populous industrial countries of South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Latin America. How do we finance these clean energy projects in those countries? And this is a problem that I've seen in Southeast Asia, because you talk about, yes, we can build solar panel plants, wind projects, but these are generally relatively small projects, whereas the people with the billions of dollars don't want lots of little projects. Yeah, they just want to put $1 billion in and see a return, not have to negotiate through numerous $5 million projects. So I think, Dr. Adnan may have comments on this, there needs to be a way to package renewable energy projects so that they are large enough to attract serious investors, because the money is there in private funds and whatever, the money is there. I've seen that in Southeast Asia, the technology is there, they just can't get stuff done. And that's partly, again, related to the governments themselves that have allowed difficult investment conditions to prevail. I just leave it politely like that. So it's very difficult to find projects that are bankable. So there's this action at both ends. How can we package projects, better investment conditions? And then I think, one really can accelerate this alternative energy deployment with existing technologies. That's not to say there will not be a crisis of fossil fuels, but at least we need to start working to get ourselves out of that crisis, as we did in the 1980s.
Professor, we already have an inkling of serious problems. Last week itself, we had a meeting in Bonn, which ended in very bitter, with very great bitterness and acrimony. And there was a deep divide between the developed countries and the developing countries. And the developing countries wanted assurances relating to funding. If you want us to make major changes, as it is, we are very seriously affected by the pandemic, and by other inherent issues of being a developing country, very serious issues relating to unemployment, etc. And on the one hand, so we just don't have the resources. And of course, the historic argument that was put up at Bonn was that historically, you caused the problem. So that old problem, that dilemma that that has divided international community remains with us. So after the camaraderie of Paris, you have the acrimony of Bonn, and we have parted on very bad terms, and now the entire burden has come on Egypt that they have to solve this problem. So we are not going anywhere with regard to this business of funding the energy transition.
I think we have to, and again, Dr. Adnan will be able to comment, we have to separate public funding from private funding. Private funding from different funding sources, I would say it's enough for renewable energy, clean energy, etc. There's a lot of it there. It's just got nowhere to go in the developing countries. Public funding, different issue. We're all bankrupt, but Dr. Adnan can pick up there.
Well, I agree with Dr. Philip that private funding is available for projects that are bankable at the size of hundreds of millions. Yeah. I was attending a meeting in Sicily about hydrogen, and there were a lot of representatives of financial institutions. And they told me I'm not going to be able, because of Chatham House rules, I will not be able to attribute to anybody. But they told me that we will not look at 5 and 10 million hydrogen project or a green or blue. It doesn't matter. We are willing to finance blue or green projects if it's 100 million, but it has to be bankable. Yes. It has to be bankable. They're not just give it away. Bankables mean you're not going to have $100 million project bankable for green hydrogen today because green hydrogen is very expensive. So they're going to go first, they're going to go to renewable projects, and these will make return, and these are very good, and they will contribute. That's one step. But I think you, Ambassador, you have raised a very important point, and I think it's Prime Minister of India who had said it many times, that if you want us to solve the problem you caused, pay us the money. I think there is no escape that the governments of the industrial countries have to find a way to pay for that portion, not all of the CO2, the legacy CO2 in the atmosphere, but at least for part of it in two ways. One, what they are doing, which is excellent. They're investing heavily in energy efficiency in their own countries and in renewable projects. And in this Oxford meeting, we heard about so many projects, ways to do it. But we have to remember that most of the growth in energy consumption is not in the developed countries. Europe only contributes 8% of the global emissions. So if they drop that by half, that's still the problem is there. So it's twofold. Somehow they have to find demonstrated way that they're contributing not only to reducing the growth, but for compensating for what they have put up in the atmosphere over the last 150 years. Part of it, because you cannot compensate for all of it. And the other part is to help in the developing countries to reduce the growth of the emission. And I think if we don't do anything, there will be a day within 10, 15 years, we have to use geoengineering across the world. That is, we will have to install direct air capture and put the CO2 from the atmosphere underground to prevent a global catastrophe, climate catastrophe. And I think we have a choice. We either wait, and that will be inevitable. I don't know whether it's 10 or 15 or 20 years, but there will come a day when we have to do that. That's one choice. And the other is to choose to do what I described in the first place, to do the two-track, to work what the European and American OECD are doing, but to really get serious about public investment in the developing countries to compensate for part of the legacy atmosphere CO2 emission and to help them to reduce their contribution to while at the same time allowing them to grow. And that brings me to a point. You cannot have your cake and eat it too, applies to too many things. You cannot call for Saudi Arabia to increase its oil production currently and tell Saudi Arabia at the same time you should not increase your investment in oil and gas. What does that mean? There's got to be rationality. There's got to be a transition. You should say, you should reduce your investment, but not stop them, and tune them in a way that satisfies the interests of everybody. The developing countries' need for fossil fuels and the need for energy transition. What does that mean? Start funding public money into carbon capture with fossil fuels in the developing country, at the source, at Saudi Arabia, where they can do it. They can capture and put it underground. And I think we need carbon tax at the international level, but that carbon tax has to go to decarbonize the fuels. Carbon tax should not go to the treasury, because most of the tax today on gasoline in industrial countries, you know that, Dr. Philip, the price of gasoline is very high in the West, but most of it is taxes that goes to the treasury. What should happen is that you should have a carbon tax, and that carbon tax should go to the energy transition. That's where I think it happened, and that means part of it should go back to the developing countries.
Before we discuss country-wise, we do a country-wise analysis or region-wide analysis. I wanted to raise two topics with regard to renewables. One is hydrogen. Dr. Adnan, you are a very strong votary of hydrogen. You have written extensively on the subject. My own very basic research has shown that hydrogen, while a magic fuel for the future, is still some way to go. On the one hand, there is argument that, this is something that we should all invest in. And finally, if Europe has to rid itself of dependence on the Russians, hydrogen is the future. But reading the basic literature on the subject shows that hydrogen could get viable, commercially viable, and therefore competitive, maybe in about 20 years or so. Perhaps you could elaborate on this, sir, and explain to us what is happening with regard to hydrogen and where are we going with it?
Yeah, I think what you characterize is reasonably correct. What the main problem is that we're going about hydrogen, investment in hydrogen, in somewhat ideological way. I would prefer to go about investment in hydrogen, clean hydrogen, agnostically. That means it doesn't matter if the hydrogen, clean hydrogen, was generated from gas with carbon capture to reduce the footprint, or whether it's renewable. And currently, if you do the two, the blue hydrogen from natural gas would win by far. Its cost is almost half. So what you should do is that large projects should go currently to blue hydrogen, while development of the electrolyzer, which is really the main cost right now of the green hydrogen, is the cost of the electrolyzer. There is plenty of renewable energy at low cost available. The problem is that as blue hydrogen or gray hydrogen, whatever it is. So the investment has to go in these two ways. And I think right now, only the oil and gas producers are investing in blue hydrogen. And Europe is telling, most Europe is saying, that, okay, I will import from you whatever hydrogen you generate, but I will invest only in green hydrogen. At least the Germans are saying that bluntly. The Germans saying, we will invest only in your countries in green hydrogen. And I think that's misplaced.
Dr. Philip, one more question with regard to renewables, and that's nuclear energy. At one time, about 2 decades ago, it was hailed as that magic fuel, a magic wand that would get rid of the world's energy security concern. And then you had Fukushima, and it went back onto the back burner. And now countries seem to be very ambivalent. Even in the developed world, you have countries that are very wary of this fuel. On the other hand, countries like India and China have robustly asserted their commitment to energy, to nuclear energy. But in India, for instance, we found it very difficult to start new projects because of local resistance. There's a worry in the local community. From time to time, you have articles that come up and talk about genetic disorders and things like that. What do you feel, sir? Where are we with regard to nuclear energy? Is it still a very vital and important fuel for the future as far as renewables are concerned?
I think it wasn't just Fukushima that deterred governments from looking at nuclear. It was also the rising cost and the delays of construction. And we've seen that in France and Finland and in the UK. So it was cost issues as well as obviously safety issues. But particularly after the COP meeting in Glasgow, nuclear came back on the agenda because you can have medium, large-scale baseload that is low carbon. And I think there are two lines of argument that can say this may be the moment, other than the low carbon argument. One is that improvements in pressurized water reactors have made them safer. Remember that the Fukushima reactor was quite old. And secondly, they are developing what they call small modular reactors, though they needn't be that small. And they, based on pressurized water technology, but they are smaller and they are modular, and therefore in simple terms can be assembled in a supply chain rather than specially built every time. And that should make them cheaper. Should, we do not know yet, because nobody is producing them en masse. The further argument is that there are technological developments of reactor processes that were discovered 50, 60, 70 years ago that are now being developed, and people are trying to make them commercially viable. The latest with the Chinese have got going is the high temperature gas cooled reactors, and there are other molten salt reactors, etc. So you've got a new technology, completely new technologies coming along for reactors that could again be relatively small, that should, in quotes, if you believe the marketing, be safer. Also, these smaller reactors can be more easily transported. So it means in certain countries like Indonesia or the Philippines with islands, you could bring in, or remote areas in Siberia, where the Russians have already done this, you can bring in a reactor on a barge and literally connect it up to the local grid. So there's a load of opportunities out there. So a lot of countries, including developing countries, including Egypt, and Jordan and others, are even Singapore, where I'm still officially based. They are saying, yeah, in 20 years' time, we could have nuclear power. I think we're at a curve here, from everybody not wanting it to the potential for it being deployed at scale. But
so that is a good point you have made. Popular resistance, that is the main. That's the main concern. And you know, there are activists who are very actively hostile to nuclear power. They're able to generate popular resistance, and this is true even in the developed world, not just in the developing world. And therefore, there is this very grave concern, deep fear of nuclear energy at the popular level. How would you address that, sir?
Well, I think it varies from country to country. I always joke, possibly unfairly, that in Britain we are a nation of shopkeepers, and so that the main objection to the Hinkley Point C plant being built by EDF was the cost. That was what everybody objected to. In other countries, I think, different, even in Japan, opinions post-Fukushima are changing because they want energy. In Korea, they seem to be changing. So I think public opinion changes either through time and forgetting accidents, or through government encouragement, or whatever, but it's probably culturally based. So there will be some countries that will never support nuclear. There will be others that will support cautiously, and there'll be other societies that will be happy to have nuclear.
So, sir, with this discussion relating to energy transition in general terms, we come to China. Dr. Philip, China is presenting to us a very confusing picture. At the beginning of last year, their president, Xi Jinping, had said that they want to move away from coal. And then as their economy surged, the demand for coal also increased. And actually they're using a lot of coal these days, contrary to their earlier, their earlier plan. And therefore you have a very major increase in greenhouse emissions in China, much more than they had planned before, while it's contrary to their own opinion, their own plan. Right? China is, of course, now a very major buyer of Russian energy, both oil and gas. So how would you characterize Chinese energy policy? Is it a knee-jerk reaction to the current crisis? Is there something they have thought through over the longer term? And where are they supposed to go? Because we thought they were going to be leaders as far as energy transition is concerned.
Well, I think, I mean, we're focusing on China, but I think all national leaders are facing the same problem today. I mean, in Germany and in Britain, coal-fired power plants are restarting. But to focus on China, yeah, I mean, there is this tension between the climate agenda and economic growth, energy security, employment. Okay, and in the short term, you know, energy security, employment, economic growth always wins. It wins in most countries, but particularly in China, particularly I think with the lead up to the party meeting in November of this year, when Xi Jinping aspires to be given a third term as chairman of the party. So yeah, this is a knee-jerk reaction. It goes back to September of last year, as it were, when the lights started going out in many parts of China. And yeah, and that was before the war in Ukraine. And they said, you know, coal mines produce as much coal as you can, coal-fired power stations produce as much coal-fired power as you can. I would see this, as you just expressed it, as a knee-jerk reaction to a crisis that was not related to the war. Obviously, it's been exacerbated by the war. But no, I think Xi Jinping has pinned his colors to the mast of climate change. And, you know, there are new committees and new plans to push forward with ever greater scale of renewable energy, and all, you know, solar energy must have storage beside it, new pump storage, hydro, nuclear power, etc., etc. So that climate mitigation agenda remains. It's interrupted in the short term, I would read it, by the energy security agenda.
So we have just seen over the last few days two very dramatic announcements. China is placing a space station which is supposed to harness solar energy and which will give unlimited electricity to China, and possibly, if the technology works, for the rest of the world. And simultaneously, Japan has announced that they are going in the opposite direction. They are placing a huge turbine at the ocean floor, and they expect to use the ocean currents and they will generate the limitless quantities of electricity. So you have these two extraordinary developments which are of high tech value and which have a great promise if they work. What is your own sense about these two technologies? So far, they are perhaps not tested, but could they be that magic wand we are looking at for?
I think the easy answer is no. But I think, to step back, I think what's very clear is that all the technologies that we talk about, and some of which are being deployed today, have long lead times to scale up. Okay, and you know, the solar voltaic effect was discovered in the late 19th century. We're only now taking advantage of it. But more seriously, I mean, if we look at carbon capture, you know, this has been on the agenda for 20 years or more, and it still isn't scaled up, really. There are a growing number of significant sized plants, mainly in North America. China to my surprise, really hasn't taken it seriously. You know, it's it uses 50% of the world's coal each year, and yet it doesn't have any really large projects. It's got a lot of smaller projects. This will change, but reading the latest policy documents, there's no real incentives for companies to build lots of large-scale carbon capture. So I think, yes, these technologies, I'd say particularly the turbine technology to harness tidal power, you know, this is proven, but not in the deep ocean. Yeah, it's there, it will work, but it will take decades to scale up to such a scale that, one, it is economically viable, and two, it actually makes a difference. So I think all technologies are great. Let them try them out, see what happens, you know, come back in 20 or 30 years and see if it's scaled up, because it's scale that is the challenge.
So looking at Asia, India, and the Asean countries, there is a very strong rhetoric emerging from this region in terms of commitment to energy transition and sensitivity as far as climate change is concerned. But the reality on the ground is quite different. Massive consumption of fossil fuels in India. When we look at the future in India, even the last report made a few years ago, 5-6 years ago, spoke of a fossil fuel future, where fossil fuels would provide more than 80%, in the best case scenario, 80% of India's energy needs, fossil fuels, in 2040. And I think that, 5-6 years later, we could even push the scenario to 2050 and would not be wrong. And the scenario is similar as far as ASEAN is concerned. They again talk a lot about energy transition, but they are crucially dependent on fossil fuels. And there doesn't seem to be anything happening that is so significant that would indicate real change. Are they serious players as far as energy transition is concerned, or is it all political rhetoric?
I'm going to focus on Southeast Asia because I know it rather better than India. It's 10 different countries, if we set aside Brunei and Singapore that are very small. And what I often summarize by saying, these efforts to push the low carbon transition vary in time and space. So different countries push forward or not at different times. And in recent, Thailand has been, because it is an energy importer, it has actually made very steady progress with different forms of renewable energy, including bioenergy. Vietnam in recent years has made huge progress in solar and now offshore wind. It really is installing at a good rate. It's got problems absorbing the electricity because of the grid, but it's really making the efforts, again, because it is an energy importer. Philippines is starting to make the effort again, is looking at nuclear. So what seems to be the effective pressure is the need to be an energy importer. If you are an energy importer, how do you get energy security? You build more renewables. But of course, the problem in Southeast Asia and in India is that demand is going up for energy. And even if you start building lots and lots of renewable energy, you're still left with more and more fossil fuel. And of course, as you intimated earlier, Europe has the advantage that demand is flat, so it's easy to increase your proportion. If we come to Indonesia, which is different from the other countries that I've mentioned because it's rich in coal, gas, and to a lesser extent, oil. It's got a huge industry based on fossil fuels. It is also, if I put it politely, state capacity is weak. It's very difficult to get stuff done on the ground because local governments and local interests are very powerful. So I think Indonesia, which is the most populous, the most fossil fuel using nation in Southeast Asia, is going to really struggle to get renewable energy and or possibly nuclear and energy efficiency really pushed through in an effective way, at least under the current governance systems.
Dr. Adnan, whenever we look at the Middle East, we think of two things, energy and geopolitics. And with President Biden's visit to the region, both of them are coming together. Here you have an extraordinary situation. Here is an American president who, well before he entered the White House, had been speaking disparagingly about a very major energy producer and its leader, using terminology like pariah, and said, I will not have anything to do with that. Then a self-created crisis forces him to want to speak to these two people in the UAE and Saudi Arabia. And according to Wall Street Journal, they don't take his call. And now you see the spectacle of the leader of the free world, the most powerful country in the world, going hand in hand to Riyadh and to the other part, asking, pleading for higher higher production. What is all this about? Is this indicative of a serious approach to energy and to geopolitics? Or are we again seeing this mindless entry into serious geopolitics, mindless entry as we saw earlier with regard to Iraq and Afghanistan, getting into a conflict situation without any serious planning in advance? And now seeking desperately the support of major West Asian countries. How would you respond to this?
Well, I'm going to refrain about characterizing what has happened, because I think we have discussed it and you have characterized it very nicely.
I did it for you.
Yeah, so you saved me of characterizing what has happened. But you are right. I think the two issues are working hand in hand. Geopolitics is at the core of the visit and at the core of the discussion, because for a long time, the relationship, which is a strategic relationship, it continues to be a strategic relationship between Saudi Arabia, the Gulf, and the United States, and the rest of the Gulf, including Kuwait and have you. We have a strategic relationship. What does that mean, strategic relationship? That means it is not affected by blips here and there, because otherwise you don't have a strategic relationship. So I think we have to understand what has happened over the last few years, including what the relationship between the head of the state in the two countries, in the context that they remain strategically allies, but currently they're having problems. And therefore they need to talk it out. They need to talk out these current strains that are affecting the strategic relationship. And it will, what are the issues to be discussed? On the one hand, the Gulf countries led by Saudi Arabia are very unhappy about the American position vis-a-vis Iran from the Obama time, not from now. Obama went ahead, President Obama went ahead, signed the GCPOA nuclear agreement with Iran, with the rest of the world, with very little difference to the views of the Gulf countries on this agreement. I was involved a little bit in the preparation of the Gulf views through the Kuwait and other things. And what the Gulf wanted from that agreement, they wanted beyond just the strict denuclearization of Iran nuclear weapons program. They also wanted the safety aspect to be included. There was no mention in the joint agreement about Iran entering into the nuclear safety regime, nuclear safety, not safeguard. That is, Iran is not a member. They have a reactor and they are not a member of the International Atomic Energy Agency safety convention, nuclear safety convention, which is really a dilemma. They have an operating reactor sitting on the Gulf. You have 6 Gulf countries. If an accident happened, the Gulf countries are saying, what happened? That's just a small piece. But more importantly, the Gulf countries wanted Iran to refrain from funding, Hezbollah and other parties, because they were creating problems for these two countries, Gulf countries. But these views were put in a package aside. They were not entered into the agreement. And that created irritation, significant irritation. And so I think what is needed now, you have a strategic alliance, but they need to talk about these things and not just increasing the oil production, which is, by the way, it is a fact that Saudi Arabia at most can pump 1 million barrels a day extra over the next 12 months. They can do that, but not immediately. But that's at most according to all of the information I have. Emirate may be able to put 300 million barrels. As I said earlier, Russia, because of the sanction, because the time it takes them to redirect the oil will flow into the eastward. Currently, we're seeing that. But it's going to take time. You don't have pipelines, so you have to redirect the tankers. That takes a long time. You need ports. So Russia probably would drop about 2 million, 2.5 million over the next 12 months of oil. And Saudi Arabia and Emirates and others can only compensate by 1.5. So that's part of the discussion. But you cannot just only talk about one part without the other part. And that's what I think is happening. And it's not going to go like this, and it's going to take a series of events. I think what's helpful is that tactically, is that the US and allies' discussion with Iran does not appear to be going positively in terms of return to the GCOP agreement. And I think also the war in Ukraine has heightened the importance of energy security. As you said, President Biden took a decision about the oil embargo without enough preparation. And I think it's time now to sit down quietly and work all of these issues out. And the visit is symbolic. And we know that people call each other names and then they go back and discuss it. People go to war and then they sit down.
And they become good friends. Sir, in fact, talking about strategic partnership, I read this article by Stephen Cook and Martin Indyk, joint article, where they recommended to the kingdom as it prepares for Biden's visit, pointing out what a low status the kingdom has in the United States, particularly in the Congress, and in a very nice way, they then recommend to the kingdom that you need to make a more formal, open-ended commitment to use your excess oil production to stabilize oil prices at reasonable levels, end your production quota agreement with Russia, and provide Europe with an alternative to Russian oil. Isn't that a rather ambitious set of demands, which a very close friend of the kingdom is making to their strategic partner?
Yeah, I would say, look at where the think tank that Martin Indyk works for. I know where he works for. He used to be ambassador of the United States, both in Egypt and Israel. And if I'm not mistaken, Martin Indyk. And he is working for a think tank that represents more of the right and more of the, if you allow me to use the word, it's also more aligned with Israel and its views. It's well known. So I think they would be pushing the Saudi Arabia to the Abraham Accord indirectly. That's I think what they are hinting at. Whether Saudi Arabia will move closer to the Abraham Accord will depend on what the United States views and decisions vis-a-vis Iran and its attempt for hegemony across the Gulf.
That is what Biden would really like to achieve. And he's putting whatever pressure they can. But I noticed another thing, Dr. Philip and Dr. Adnan, that over the last year, as President Biden became more and more disengaged from the region and indicated that he is less interested in the region and really wants to focus elsewhere, the region itself is really functioning in terms of a post-US diplomacy. Look at the engagement, 5 engagements between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Turkey reaching out to the UAE and Saudi Arabia. The Crown Prince, as I'm speaking to you, His Royal Highness, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, is in Turkey. Turkey reaching out to all of these. The region, without any American involvement, is looking very, very different. And therefore, we are possibly not likely to go back to the old era of so-called strategic partnership, but possibly a new post-American era where the Americans remain major partners, but the region takes control of its own diplomacy. What do you think, sir, both of you, Dr. Philip and Dr. Adnan?
I will leave it to Dr. Adnan, as I'm not equipped to answer.
Right.
I'll talk about American engagement in Asia, but not in the Middle East.
Yeah, Dr. Adnan.
Well, definitely you are on the right track, is that the region is now looking to multipolarity relationship. They are looking at China. And you asked me a question that Martin Endek wants Saudi Arabia to drop Russia from the OPEC Plus and compensate. Is that going to happen, in my view? When I was in OPEC, we used to invite Russia to the meetings of OPEC as an observer. And we wanted them always to support the decision of OPEC to adjust the oil output in order to respond to the shortages or pluses in the market prices. And Russia would come to the meetings and they give a lot of lip service that we support, but they never took any real action. And this is a well-known fact. So what the Saudis have done over the last 10 years, they have invested heavily in building confidence with the Russian, to the point where the Russians signed in 2015 the declaration, cooperation, that's what created the OPEC Plus. So I think the Saudis are not going to give that up easy. There will be a very heavy price to give that up. And I think, but that's only one part. So they're building relationship with Turkey, they're building relationship with China, with India, with Southeast Asia, and they're looking at Africa. And when I say they, I don't mean the Saudi Arabian alone. Look at what the Emirates are doing with their investment, even in the energy transition, the rest of the Gulf. The problem of that the rest of the MENA region is that the rest of the MENA region, look at Egypt. Egypt continues to be a heavyweight, but because of its economic decline, it has lost the ability to continue to be an effective leader, but it cannot be ignored because of its population weight, and it's because where it is sitting. And so that's the reason you see Saudi Arabia, including Egypt, in the alliance. And in their discussion. So that's in summary what I would say on this.
I think you're absolutely right, sir. I agree with your assessment. So looking at the Middle East as a whole now, in terms of energy, the world needs hydrocarbons, and possibly hydrocarbons will remain a major part of the global energy share for the next 30 years at least, if not longer. And hence, the world's dependence on stability in the region so that we get these supplies. But at the same time, the region is under pressure to shift to a post-oil future. And indeed, Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030 and all the other vision documents in the other Gulf countries indicate a shift in favor of a post-oil economy. But these are very serious challenges. And according to observers, none of the projects is actually working to full capacity. I don't think they have had the achievements that they might have wanted to have. But again, we come back to this cruel contradiction that on the one hand, you are dependent massively on the region for its supplies. And on the other hand, you keep on saying, look, we are going to energy transition. So how do you expect West Asia to be responding to this? This is what I wanted to ask you, sir.
Is that to Dr. Philip?
No, I mean, if Dr. Philip wishes to answer, I'm very happy with that.
Why don't I give Dr. Adnan a rest? I think there are.
I'll give it. Yeah.
There are two ways to look at this. A number of ways. One is the world still needs oil and gas. Where is it? It's in the Middle East, okay? But in the meantime, that's production side. When it comes to the consumption side, the argument would be, I'm not saying it's my argument, the argument would be for your domestic consumption, you should start moving away from consuming fossil fuels to using renewable energy. And many of these countries, particularly in the Middle East, North Africa, has great potential for solar energy in vast areas. And so start building that so that your own consumption in the Middle East is cleaner than it has been in the past. But it is also an economic argument, I think, that these countries would be well advised to diversify their economy, their sources of energy, so they are ready for this low carbon world where they are not only using clean energy, but are part of the supply chain as well, including for hydrogen, etc. So I think, although it appears to be a contradiction, there is a logic to it. You know, produce it because there are countries that are going to use it, but try and reduce your own consumption of fossil fuels in the Middle East to renewable, not least because there are a huge potential for solar there. So that is, I'm not saying it's my argument, that is how one could frame that argument, the difference between production and consumption.
Let me add, if you allow me,
sir.
to what Dr. Philip has said. In addition to the issue of reduce your consumption substituted by renewable domestically and have it available for export, but what they are doing, two countries in particular, they are putting massive investments to decarbonize the export. And we see that in NEOM and Masdar and so many other projects, and allocating capital, 150 billion here, 200 billion there. It's happening. But I think what some countries are missing, and they're not able to do it, and I give my country as an example, Kuwait, we're not able to realize that the average consumer, while renewable is very cheap, in Saudi Arabia right now, Aqua Power, I think, is bidding less than 2 cents per kilowatt hour. And they're winning them, and they're doing it all over the Middle East. But there is an initial capital cost. So if you're looking at the potential of the distributed renewable, which has a great potential, the average consumer is not going to foot the bill because the cost of electricity to him is almost zero. So that's one thing these countries have to do to reform their energy, electric power policies and put it at fair and subsidize the cost of renewable to the average consumer. And that, if they do that, and some of them started to do it, but they haven't, I think if they do that, you're going to see a dramatic increase in renewable generation and reduction of footprints. And at the same time, the state is involved in these huge mega projects to capture carbon, put it underground, and benefit from it as an export. So that's one point that is missing in the debate, because the potential for renewable is not only at the central level. You know, if you look at Riyadh or Kuwait City or Doha City, they are mostly flat. These cities are mostly single family dwelling, all right? Except Dubai, that's an exception. But with that, you could put almost in every rooftop solar plant and insulate better the houses to reduce the consumption. That's demand side. But that's a capital cost. Why should I do it as a homeowner when I'm getting the power from the state for essentially nothing?
Yes, yes. So just as an academic exercise at the end of our broad discussion, I have read this article in the Foreign Affairs, which spoke of a new energy order, written by Jason Bordoff and Megan O'Sullivan, spoke of a new energy order made up of energy security on the one hand and climate action on the other. I had a question for both of you. Can we really speak of an energy order, a global energy order, given the very powerful impact of geopolitics? We are today in the throes, not just of the Ukraine war, we are in the throes of a major global competition. possibly a reworking of global order as we have had up to now. And all of this is going to impact on energy. Therefore, what order are we really talking about? And what I personally feel, it looks to me, looking at the example of India and China as major consumers, that we are going to be, at least for next 30 years, if not longer, heavily dependent on fossil fuels, and possibly the kind of commitments that we need to make with regard to climate action may not be forthcoming. That's a concern that I have.
Can I start?
Yes, sir.
To answer the question, I think we're not going to have in the near future a new global order that my friend Jason Border and Megan are calling for. And the reason for that is look at the historical. I mean, look at 1973, OPEC, and then you had IEA established in order to respond to some OPEC member countries' action, the embargo. So you had the global energy order was OPEC, IEA, but that did not represent the interest of everybody. That represented the interest of few producers and the coalition of the consumers in the developed countries. And initially, the OPEC and the IEA would not meet in public, and I am witness to that. They would only meet in the hotels in Vienna or Paris. But then the ice was broken, and in 1990, France, and then we started talking to each other and started visiting and holding technical things. And then we realized that we need to bring in everybody else into the equation, China and India and Latin America and Africa. So what they created what's called the International Energy Forum, which probably not many people know about, sitting in Riyadh. Okay, but the International Energy Forum has not really been given with the tools to be the base of the international energy order. So what I'm saying is that despite a history of 50 years and attempts here and attempt there, we did not have the framework or even the seeds of a successful international energy order. So I don't see that happening unless the other side, what is the other side? The other side is India and China and Latin America come into the picture forcefully, and not only through the climate change, which is happening through the COP, the Conference of the Party, but what is missing is an energy forum to represent the whole world. And that we are missing that. And so if you want to have a joint global order of energy and climate, you have to work on the missing part, which is an order at the new order at the energy side. And it cannot be under the climate umbrella, which is the UNFCCC. It's got to be somehow a new umbrella, maybe strengthening the International Energy Forum in Riyadh, giving it power. But currently it doesn't have the power, it doesn't have the resources. It's just sitting there as a secretariat, doing some good work, but really not very effective, because China and India and others are only there to be represented by diplomats, not really by real action.
Yes, absolutely right. I was involved with the IEF, both in the Petroleum Ministry and then as ambassador in Saudi Arabia. And I remember I supported the IEF very strongly. And I used to talk with my Russian colleague and my Chinese colleague to show enthusiasm. But I noticed at that time that the producers and the IEA and OPEC had greater camaraderie with each other and didn't give us much time and much attention. Like we were not included. And it was India, China, and Russia and we had no mechanism of our own. If you remember, we started the round table dialogue of producers and consumers. And, it worked quite well. And it is something that we could really see as going forward, but then we didn't want to be a cabal of Asian consumers and Asian producers. We are all part of a larger world. Much has changed since then, but I agree with you. Now, before we end, and the lady is getting a little tense over there, before we end, just one ballpark question for both of you separately. When we now, after this very, very substantial dialogue, where many issues have come up and have been elaborated, 2050, Do you feel when we reach or come to 2050, we are likely to have a significant shift in favor of renewables, of clean energy, or or alternatively, hardly any progress at all, or a mixed scenario of a little bit of progress, but overwhelmingly fossil fuels being the dominant scenario? What do you feel?
I've, I'm a middle of the road person, I think, on this. I think efforts will be made and progress will be made. Most countries that are industrializing will be using a higher proportion of clean energy. But I fear that this will not be enough to meet the required scenarios. And this has actually been my belief for the last 21 years. I had a letter in the Financial Times in 2001 that said Kyoto will not work, get out the lifeboats. And I fear what we've seen in the last 20 years has not changed my view. We will make efforts, but again, it comes back to, can we scale up those efforts across the world? And at the moment, we have failed. And as Dr. Adnan has said, we're not seeing yet the financial mechanisms to accelerate that scaling up. So I am cautiously pessimistic that things will be sorted as they should be sorted.
I agree essentially with what Dr. Philip said. We will be in the middle of the road. We'll make progress here and there. I think what's missing is leadership, political leadership, that is willing to be rational, not ideological, or to follow the momentum. You know, I mentioned so many times the case of Germany. I found it puzzling that Germany was led by a physicist who ran on platform for nuclear and then changed her mind when election came after Fukushima and phased out the nuclear after she brought it in. And what I found also puzzling, and this is what led me to be somewhat pessimistic, is that Germany right now is in the middle of a crisis and they want to consume more coal and at the same time shut down their remaining reactors. That's just puzzling as a scientist. You know, I'm a scientist. I think what will happen, we will be in the middle of the road. And if the inevitable happens, that means we have reached a point of no return in the climate and all else fails, we should have in place our insurance policy in carbon capture, direct air capture, and other solutions so that we can deploy them and prevent a climate catastrophe.
Thank you. We started our discussion with the sense of crisis, and we are ending it with the same sense of crisis. That yes, we have very daunting issues, a combination of energy and geopolitics coming together and opening up extraordinary uncertainties with regard to the political and economic future of the world. Energy is going to be central in terms of regional prosperity and global prosperity. We don't have all the answers. I think we have identified many questions, many of the issues. We also have a sense of certain policy decisions that could be taken by governments. The two speakers here have also highlighted the fact that we need to have leadership, a clarity of vision and leadership, which would steer the international community. But the international community, usually I have found, it focuses on the immediate problem. And the immediate problem today is Ukraine and the preservation of the US-led hegemonic order. And the alternative, the emergence of multipolarity in an environment fraught with uncertainties, including problems between India and China. All of these make it very difficult for leaders to think clearly about the medium or long-term future. But what we have done today is to clarify issues and to suggest where we could go forward, particularly with regard to hydrogen and nuclear energy as possible fuels for the future. Thank you very much. and I wish you all the best.
Thank you.
Thank you. On behalf of Dr. Mohammed Al-Ali, CEO of Trans Research and Advisory, I'd like to sincerely thank and appreciate our distinguished speakers of today's E-Symposium titled The Energy Transition and Future Implications and Prospects for the MENA region and Asia. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Adnan, and thank you, Dr. Philip. Thank you for your patience with me.